So it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this first Pathways Forum. I'm Gilles Marcignac. I'm a member of the Future of Secretariat, and I'm in charge of coordinating the Pathways Initiative. Of course, I'm not alone in doing this, and the rest of the Pathways steering group is in the room today, so you will probably get to meet at least some of them during the session. To begin, I would like to take a couple of minutes to set the scene and tell you what the intention behind the Pathways Initiative is and how the Pathways Forum fits into this. As people who work in the field of sustainability, we often find ourselves caught in the urgency of the global challenges that we are facing. These are issues that touch us, move us, and impact us directly. And as a result, we are prompted to act and to act fast. But when doing so, when acting fast all the time, key aspects of how and why we act can sometimes become confusing or unclear. And the Pathways Initiative therefore aims to create a space where we can pause every now and then and ask ourselves, in the transformative journey represented by the Pathways for Sustainability approach, where are we exactly? Where should we go next? And how can we get there? And we feel that addressing these questions will only reinforce the drive and confidence with which, as a community, we can carry on and support this transformative journey. And within the Pathways Initiative, the Pathways Forums will be a key element in constructing this space of collecting reflection and learning. So every 2 months, we will open the Pathways Forum for all of you to join. The format and structure of the forum will change based on the topic and goal for each session. So one thing I must emphasize is that this first forum is not necessarily representative of what future forums will be like. Eventually, in fact, we hope that all Pathways Forums will be largely the result of a co-design, a co-construction between us coordinating the Pathways Initiative and you as members of the Pathways community. You will really be able to play an active part in shaping this space, and we look forward to working together with all of you, promoting the learning, research being done in support of societal transformation towards sustainability. In fact, in a reminder that we've sent a few days ago, we asked you to use Jamboard, which is an online tool that we'll use as well for this session. And there was a map where you could place a pin to show where you were based. And I must say that it already looks like a fairly international forum, and we're very pleased with that. So I want to thank all of you and our speakers, Oonsie Biggs, Adrian Ely, and Serena Schneider, for being here today and bringing life and meaning to the Pathways Forum. Without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Ariane de Bremont from the Global Land Program, who is also a member of the Pathways Initiative Steering Group, and who will lead you into the heart of the matter. Thank you.
Thank you, Gilles. Good morning, everyone, or good evening, depending on where you are this autumnal vernal equinox time. It's really great to see everyone here. And as Gilles said, I think the objective for today is really to create a space for us, for researchers and practitioners who are engaging with this topic and with processes of adaptive learning to design and implement and evaluate pathways to sustainability and connect to each other and find ways for us to gather as a community and interact and learn. So today will be our first inaugural Pathways session. And just to let you know the themes, I'm going to go through the themes that we're going to discuss today very briefly and then turn it over to our speakers. So we're going to hear from Oonsie Biggs, Adrian Ely, and Serena Schneider on 3 related topics. And so we're going to start out with Oonsie and her talk on navigating pathways to just, thriving, and sustainable futures. And the starting point here is that we want the need to better understand how regional pathways can be implemented and interact to produce outcomes for people and nature. And so this acts as sort of an introduction not only to the forum, but to the initiative as a whole. And the articles that these talks are based on will also be available afterwards for you to dive deeper and to reflect further after our session. We'll move from Oonsie's talk to Adrian's on collaborative research across disciplines, cultures, and contexts. And his work focuses on the collaborations across disciplines, cultures, and contexts, and focuses what transformation sustainability can mean in different parts of the world. And so I think one point that really stands out here is how these normative commitments differ between different regional case studies, and Adrian's going to give us some insights as to that. And lastly, we'll listen to Serena Schneider, who works on the normative dimensions of sustainability. And she's done this for many, many years. And I think there's only one paper here from 2019 that we're referencing, but there are many more, as this is sort of her body of work, as I imagine for all the speakers. And here it's a little bit more holistic and specific in a sense that this will focus on normativity, and it allows us to sort of bring the issue of normativity and this deeper thinking and reflection over how we do our work into the conversation over studying and understanding pathways. So that's sort of essentially what we'll be doing. Then we'll be joining, as Gilles said, into these breakout sessions. Those will be organized by our facilitating team in Paris. And we'll be able to have some great conversations. I just want to remind you all that we will have 10 minutes per speaker. I'll introduce them quickly. And then during the presentations, participants are encouraged to post comments and questions on these sticky notes that you'll see on the page. And even if they have something written in them already, you can click in one, open it up, and write a question in Jamboard. And that should be in the chat if you're looking. And I think that's just, I think the most important thing that let's think about today as a starting point for our discussions, and that there'll be many questions left unanswered when we finish today. And those will be the space for us to continue to work together and to bring in your ideas into how we organize future sessions and move forward as a community. So without further ado, I am going to quickly introduce Oonsie and her talk on my sheet. So Raynette Oonsie Biggs is a professor, holds the DST NRF South African Research Chair in Social-Ecological Systems and Resilience. She's the co-director of the Center for Complex Systems in Transition, CST, at Stellenbosch University, and also holds a joint appointment at the Stockholm Resilience Center, SRC, at the Stockholm University in Sweden. Oonsie is co-chair of the International Program on Ecosystem Change and Society, PECS, and coordinates the Southern African Program on Ecosystem Change and Society. And so without further ado, Oonsie, pass it over to you.
Thanks so much for the invitation to speak at this, I think, exciting new initiative. And I'm very keen and interested to see how this develops and the conversations we have here. So I was asked to maybe speak briefly around a recent paper led by Elena Bennett that myself, Gary Peterson, and Lina Gordon collaborated on, called Patchwork Earth. And then also talking about this project called the Seeds of Good Anthropocenes, which we also are co-leading. So I'm going to just give a bit of a flash tour, but as Adrian mentioned, there's more resources available. So I think, as we all recognize, there's a clear need for transformational change to deal with many multiple interconnected challenges that we face at many different scales. But I think there's also a recognition that exactly what kind of future would actually be able to address these challenges that we're facing is rather unclear. I think a key point in this paper is that, in fact, there's not just one potential good future trajectory, but there are probably several different options. Obviously, there are also many potential bad trajectories that we face, but I think we're all trying to create a good world. But these different potential good futures also come with very different outcomes and trade-offs that we need to consider. So just as an example, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment scenarios, which are a little bit older now, but I think was a really interesting exercise, had several scenarios that were kind of positive, and just highlighting two here was the one called the Adapting Mosaic, which really focused on strong community-based stewardship as kind of a starting point for building sustainability and a more sustainable world, versus something like the Techno Garden scenario, which was very high-tech and driven through eco-efficiency. And if one thinks about scenarios like this, both of these scenarios, for instance, could meet most of the SDGs, but the type of world and the dynamics of that world that we might be living in could be really different, particularly in terms of things like social equity, gender relations, or racial justice, and the kind of institutions that we set up and how those are mediated. Kind of further complicating the picture is also the fact that different regions are likely to follow quite different pathways. This is largely also because of differences in values, histories, and context. So for instance, just as an analogy, maybe we could have one region following more of an adaptive mosaic kind of scenario towards sustainability, whereas another region might follow more of a techno-garden type trajectory towards the future. And whatever we see at a kind of global scale will emerge from some interaction of these different regional scale pathways. And I think that's where there's a lot of complexity and uncertainty in terms of how these different pathways may interact. And a key part of the paper that we wrote was also trying to think through a little bit the different ways in which the potential pathways that we might follow in different regions could interact. And in this line, we identified 4 different potential modes of interactions between regions and across scales. So the first one is the most simple, and I think is often a default way we think about how things aggregate. So this is just a simple addition of different regional outcomes in different places add up to some sort of global outcome. For instance, the sum of global food demand is the sum of demand from all regions. On the other hand, we have a bunch of more kind of complex interactions for instance, compensation, and that we know is quite a well demonstrated effect where, for instance, if one country bans deforestation, but demand persists, that one country maybe or region sort of solves their problem, but the problem is actually just displaced elsewhere. So that doesn't actually add up to a global transition. We also have dynamics such as learning, where action in one place or innovations in one place actually benefit everyone. So for instance, and we're seeing this with a lot of technological advances, for instance, around manufacturing of solar cells and those costs that are coming down, which can then be adopted everywhere around the world. So we don't need innovation in every single place. It can spread around. And we also have contagion, which is quite similar, but where we maybe have action or movements in one place of the part of the world that then kind of also spreads globally. And I think a very nice example is the climate strike action started by Greta Thunberg. But clearly, if we start thinking about these different ways in which regions kind of interact and how that scales up to the globe, it poses substantial challenges for thinking about pathways at the global level, pathways to sustainability, because it requires us understanding some of the cross-scale dynamics for different types of change that clearly also necessitates insights across different disciplines. But also coming from a center that's quite based in complexity, I think more importantly, it maybe also requires us to really engage with uncertainty and surprise, because there will be many things that we don't know. And so rather than thinking of it as an exception that funny things happen or surprising things happen, we should be expecting it. And how do we also set up processes and institutions and have different tools that enable us to better govern for emergence, but also be continuously monitoring for unexpected effects. So one initiative and that I find a very exciting project that we've been engaged in the past few years is the Seeds of the Good Anthropocenes initiative, which is trying to get at some of these questions and think through some of these kind of more bottom-up innovations and how those could scale to or come together to create some really different kinds of futures. So the goal of this initiative is really to explore what some good futures might be, and really emphasizing that there could be some very different types of futures. And we're really interested in also thinking about capturing alternative perspectives from some more non-dominant groups and cultures, and maybe breaking out of more conventional thinking around what a sustainable future might look like. So the project has kind of 4 key components. The first one is to collect seeds, and these seeds are what we think of as little innovations, which are not currently mainstream, but they could be different ways of thinking or doing different institutional processes or technologies. And then we use them, and I'll talk about that briefly on the next slide, to develop some radically alternative visions of the future. And then really thinking through different pathways and interventions to get to those kinds of futures, and digging into some of the trade-offs and synergies surrounding that. Just a few examples of seeds. So we've got a database with a lot of different ones, but they range from things like community currencies to changes in kind of land ownership rules, maybe small community initiatives around community gardens or technologies. So we've invested quite a lot of effort in collecting these seeds, but what we've then done is develop this kind of Manoa mashup approach, which uses different futures thinking tools to look at or develop these kind of radically alternative positive visions and explore some different pathways and trade-offs associated with those pathways. So the key things that this approach builds on are our future wheels and the 3 horizons framework. So just in brief, we take each of these seeds, and for the process we've run so far, we take 3 very different seeds, and then we kind of think through, if the seed became mainstream and it was the main way we did things in the world, what would the world look like? And then we merge 3 of very different ones, maybe a technological one, a community one, and some institutional one together, and then create a bigger picture of what this future world might be like. And some of them are quite science fiction-y, and I think quite exciting. We've also used a very kind of experiential scenarios approach, where people then act those out and really immerse themselves in the thinking of that scenario. And then we've used the 3 horizons framework as quite a powerful tool to think a little bit about how would those scenarios or these seeds grow into this kind of future. So that's in this little picture, the yellow line. So how do they go from being something small and marginal to mainstream? And then thinking through what are some of the dominant things currently in the world that would need to decline to make space for this kind of new world. So we've run these seeds mashup scenarios processes in a couple of different places. And I think there's some interesting similarities that are emerging. So just to go briefly through some of them, a key one is the key role of technology, and that some of the technological innovations we're seeing also around digitalization is really kind of changing the set of opportunities and possibilities for the ways in which we can interact. This is also partly connected to many of these scenarios show very decentralized participatory decision-making processes. The nature of work is changing in many of these scenarios, that it doesn't become mainly a thing around being able to earn money to pay bills. Post-consumerism and collaboration are key ethics. On the other hand, we also identified some key risks in terms of these kinds of future scenarios. A key one in terms of reaching these scenarios, but also that some of these good futures get captured by entrenched power structures, or people that are currently already in power kind of remain in power, and there isn't much increased space for marginal groups. Then also some of the decentralization can really actually foster more divergent values and groups that then can increase conflict. And obviously technology is always two-sided. So then just to wrap up, and this is a very brief overview of some of the work, so there's a lot more depth to it. But I think what also speaking to this forum is through this work, I think we're also identifying several kind of key potential leverage points that one might use or think about in thinking around pathways of change. So in terms of our work and the sort of developing theory of change that we're putting together, a key leverage point is a compelling vision, and having that kind of shared vision that can help provide direction for innovation at many different levels. And I think linking also to the discussions here and in Future Earth is also around how do we kind of co-produce those visions in a very broad-based science society kind of partnerships that can then also help facilitate broad-based action so that they're not kind of elite visions. Then secondly, I think we're doing quite a lot of work now on thinking about how we can foster these different seeds of change, but also the power of connecting different seeds, because they're often quite small initiatives that are quite isolated. And there seems to also be a lot of power in connecting similar seeds to learn from each other, but also sometimes connecting very different seeds that can actually come together and form what's known as these kind of proto-regimes. So they start making a bigger kind of proto-system that would be an alternative to the current system by cobbling different things together. Then thirdly, and I think this is also where a lot of our work is moving towards now, is really trying to think more about what are some of these dominant structural forces that are blocking change, and how might they be weakened. So also really understanding how some of the current large-scale dynamics and processes are really constraining the opportunities for innovation at smaller scales. And then finally, I think really thinking around co-developing governance and institutional arrangements that will enable us to navigate these emerging pathways across disparate regions of the world with disparate contexts and disparate values, and acknowledging that in any big systemic transition, there's high amounts of uncertainty and surprise. And how do we navigate that? And at the same time, really think around issues of equity, and that those don't fall off the table. And there's more information available on our website, but I hope those were some useful thoughts just to get the conversation going here today.
Thank you so much, Oonsie. And this is great. We're going to make sure that there's links available to all the website and the paper. And the paper, the most recent one, right, is Patchwork Earth, Navigating Pathways to Just, Thriving and Sustainable Futures. And that's with Elena Bennett and others, and that's in One Earth. So we'll provide the link for that as well. I believe it's open access, which is great. And I think this is really, it's also so interesting because it's such foundational work to build on, as the Seeds Initiative has been going on for such a long time, and helping, I think, us to provide direction for us, maybe for this community, this project for innovation, and to better understand how those regional initiatives can be supported by the Future Earth community, and really try to better understand, how this sort of scientific power that we have can be used, for good, especially as our scientific community itself doesn't even seem to, has a lot of different ideas as to what the right approaches are. And so those are great conversations for us to have. Thank you for leading the way on that. All right, so without further ado, I know everyone's got a lot of questions, and so I'm going to remind you again, Cosma's going to put the link to the Jamboard in the chat. The first page, you'll see a map. The second page, you'll see these sticky notes, and you can add there to the Jamboard, and we'll have 30 minutes in our breakout sessions to really dive deep into those questions. So I invite you to take a moment to reflect, think of a question you want to ask, add it there, and while we're transferring over to our second speaker, which is Adrian Ely. And I just want to introduce Adrian. He is a reader in the technology and sustainability in the Science Policy Research Unit at the University of Sussex in the UK. And he is responsible for the SPRU's executive training strategy. His academic and professional career have focused on how science, technology, and innovation can contribute to or work against the social and environmental dimensions of sustainable development. So right where we need to be. Since 2006, he's worked as a member of the STEP Center, which is a collaboration between SPRU and the Institute for Development Studies at Sussex. He was previously Deputy Director and Head of Impact and Engagement, and currently co-leads the Transformative Pathways to Sustainability Network, which is also a great precursor. And we have a lot to learn from that network as well, as a part of the work of the Center's Global Consortium. And so the paper that I think Adrian's presentation today will focus on is entitled Structured Collaboration Across a Transformative Knowledge Network, Learning Across Disciplines, Cultures, and Contexts. And that's from 2020 in sustainability. So without further ado, Adrian, handing it over to you.
Ariane has already introduced me. I'm based at SPRU, and I've been working with the STEP Centre since, well, yes, nearly 15 years. STEPS stands for Social, Technological and Environmental Pathways to Sustainability. And so pathways is quite key to the work that we've been doing since 2006. I am going to be reflecting mainly on this particular project, which has involved not only the STEP Centre and our local partners in Sussex, but also a consortium around the world, which developed around 2014. And the paper that Ariane mentioned is certainly one of the outputs of that. but I'll be sharing and pointing towards some of the others. So this is reflecting on a process of international transdisciplinary networked research and hoping to offer some insights about how future projects of similar nature might be organized to really take forward this area of knowledge and action around pathways. You can see a lot of logos down there of our partner organizations. I co-led this project with Annabel Marin, who's a colleague from Argentina. And the particular project that is the flagship of this consortium is the Pathways Transformative Knowledge Network, which was funded under the first phase of the Future Earth Transformations to Sustainability program. I think it's worth saying that this is a reflection from one particular person, the co-lead of the project, and indeed there may be other ways of viewing or experiencing what we've learned over the last 5 or 6 years. And so it'd be great if some of our colleagues named here who we've learned from and who I'm drawing upon in this presentation might also engage in future fora. So the project that I'm focusing on, I've mentioned, involved a number of different hubs. We've got 6 hubs here, and each of them involved researchers from different disciplines, but also worked in a transdisciplinary mode. So beyond the people who were mentioned and named on that slide before, we had huge numbers of organizations from civil society, from the private sector, from government, hundreds of people all contributing their own ideas. So a lot of different ideas. And one of the challenges that we tried to address here was how to make sense of these notions of pathways, notions of sustainability in these very different contexts. We embarked upon the project through a process of co-design, and we saw it as being really important that each local hub, each local context and network of actors work together to design and identify their own projects, their own sustainability challenges, rather than being driven from the project coordination. And so that's what happened. But luckily, we were able to pair up the different hubs so that they could learn across the different contexts in particular sectors, even if they'd chosen quite different sustainability challenges or problem spaces to work with. So, for example, the UK and the Argentina hubs worked together in research on agri-food systems, open source seeds in Argentina, and they established an open source seeds platform called BioLeft, and land use and land management around Brighton and Hove in the UK. So really quite different, but at least in the same sector. In our Mexican and Indian hubs, our colleagues worked on issues around water and urban sustainability. And in our Chinese and Kenyan hubs, the broad area was really about clean and inclusive development. So in China, that was about disrupting high carbon and polluting forms of industry around cement production. And in Kenya, that was about enhancing the diffusion of off-grid renewables. So really quite different empirical areas. But importantly, they were locally defined. What we needed to do was to design a project in a way that allowed us to learn across those different contexts about the role that transdisciplinary research and social science can play, not only in understanding transformations to sustainability, but also in contributing to them. And we used one tool, which I'm going to talk about really as a key part of this talk, which we've named anchors, so theoretical and methodological anchors. We were lucky because there had, even before the initiation of the Transformative Knowledge Network, there had been a history of collaboration between at least some of the hubs and members of the STEP Centre. And so there was some familiarity with some of the conceptual tools that the STEP Centre had been working with. And we used these as theoretical anchors. A lingua franca, a language that enabled us to explore conceptual lessons from each of these very different contexts. So the theoretical anchors were systems, framings, and pathways. They're not all necessarily new ideas, but they were brought together in this 2010 book by some of our colleagues here at Sussex. And we used these as a kind of a starting point around which we innovated and experimented and learned from disagreeing as well about these concepts. Just to go into a bit more detail about those theoretical anchors, they are defined formally here. These are the verbatim definitions taken from that book. And I guess this answers the question, nice words, but what do they actually mean, which is the subtitle of today's forum. So transformations are interested in systemic change. That draws from ecology. It also draws from engineering insights. It's particular configurations of dynamic, interacting, social, technological, and environmental elements. Framings, this is a real social science concept, recognizing the different ways of understanding and representing social, technological, or natural systems and their relevant environment. And pathways, our colleagues defined as the particular directions in which interacting social, technological, and environmental systems co-evolve over time. We started from there and we experimented with these concepts over the course of the project. We also adopted what we call a methodological anchor. It wasn't a particular method, but the idea of transformation laboratories, or T-labs, which draws on earlier work around social innovation labs, real-world labs. There's a whole range of different concepts. And we defined as a process involving research and transdisciplinary engagement to address a complex sustainability problem or challenge. So you can see that these are formal definitions. You can use them as anchors, but actually they also allow interpretation, and they were indeed interpreted and applied in different ways in each of our hubs. In terms of the T-labs and in terms of the architecture of the project, this is covered in the paper that Adrian mentioned before. We adopted a kind of structured project timeline, which again set certain similarities across each of the hubs, but also gave a lot of flexibility. There was research throughout, 2 rounds of T-lab workshops, but also processes of reflection between the T-labs at the beginning and end of the project, and also a real focus on cross-learning through surveys, which were filled out by each of our hub teams and fed into these discussions. So you can see the project really ended in 2018, 2019, but we have continued to work on reflecting on these lessons up until the present day. And beyond the paper that Adrian mentioned, we've also actually in a lot more detail explained our findings and our lessons in this open access book. So if you try and find this on the Routledge or Taylor and Francis website, there's a link for you to buy it, but don't go there. I'm going to share in the chat the open access link, which allows you to download it for free. This process of writing the book, which has been extremely difficult over the last year or two, as you can imagine, with COVID and the distance that we've had, has really allowed us to reflect on this learning journey more deeply. And beyond that, there have been other activities that have emerged from the since the formal end of the project. Our colleagues from India and Mexico have suggested and been leading processes of reflection and self-criticism within and across different hubs. So those processes of learning and exchange have continued. And also our colleagues from Kenya and also from Mexico have taken forward new initiatives. For example, around methods, a series of events around decolonizing methods, which are going to come together in a methods bazaar, which they're holding on the 8th of October, sorry, 8th of November. Some of the lessons, some of the learning around anchors will be discussed at the final STEPS conference on the 8th of December. But I think that the really important thing to take home from our experience is that the anchors are all well and good. They're always interpreted differently and touched down in very different ways, given the disciplinary backgrounds, let alone the sustainability challenges that are being researched in the different parts of the world. We didn't want, and actually it was the different interpretations and the experimentation around those anchors that was most important and instructive for our work. And that required a huge amount of adaptability. Now, I think adaptability is key, not only for researchers, but also for funders and for research institutions. But I think that actually science is not set up to be adaptable. Science is very much set up, a lot of science is set up so that it's rigid, so that it is well controlled, and the parameters are set from the top down, or from formal scientific centers of power. And I think that all of us need to learn to adapt to new and emerging knowledge, but also rapidly changing and transforming systems in our work. So we've tried to do that as much as possible in the project. But obviously, I think that in terms of science-based pathways for sustainability, the area of work that we're embarking on through this forum, it raises some really significant questions about science and its role in these pathways of change. Thanks.
Fantastic, Adrian. That was just wonderful. And what a great, so first of all, thanks for providing the link for downloading the book. I mean, that's going to be a great resource for all of us going forward. And I think your point on how the anchors are so interpreted so differently, especially in the context of multiple sustainability challenges. So in thinking of systems and framings and pathways, one thing that comes to mind is how our own framings as scientists are such a part of how we see the world, and also just, again, like a perfect segue, I think, into Flurina's work. How do we go about understanding our interpretations around those anchors, and how does that relate to the adaptability required in the science system? So how do we transform our setup to be able to do this new kind of science? And I think, again, like that is really one of the core driving forces bringing the community of practice together for Future Earth is, we really understand deeply that need to transform the science system. And even just the idea that within our own institutions, there might be these greater structures that in which we can network and collaborate. And I hope that this can be a space for that as well. So thank you for bringing in those really important insights. So I'd like to introduce Professor Dr. Serena Schneider. She is the scientific director and spokesperson of the executive board at Goethe University, and professor in social ecology and transdisciplinarity in Frankfurt, Goethe University, Frankfurt. Her research focuses on learning and action for sustainability transformations, as well as on transdisciplinary research and science policy for sustainability. She graduated in geography, botany, and law from the University of Basel, and her habilitation thesis at the University of Bern, where I was with her at the Center for Environment and Development for many years, what is entitled Transdisciplinary and Transformative Research for Sustainable Governance of Natural Resources Towards Intra and Intergenerational Justice. So until 2020, she served as the head of the Land Resources Cluster at the Center for Development and Environment, CDE, at the University of Bern. And so without further ado, Florina, I pass it over to you.
So I'm also very pleased to have the chance to talk to you today, and also in particular after these two very nice other talks of Adrian and Oonsie, and I think it resonates very well with my topic. I was asked to talk on normativity in sustainability research, and I think it's because there are so many misunderstandings about this topic. So, and that's was also one of the reasons why so this is Andreas Klei and Zimmermann, Tobias Buser, Maika Ingalls and Peter Messerly. We wrote this article to really reflect about what does it mean for us as sustainability scientists to deal with this normative dimension. So the starting point is that, a quick moment, I need to put this away. Voilà. The starting point of this paper is that sustainability is a basically normative concept. It is like also Oonsie has said, it could be understood as a vision, a future vision. So sustainability specifies what a more desirable future should look like. It's about targets, it's about goals. It says what is perceived as good or as bad development. And I have here on the slide the SDGs, because this is one example. So the United Nations 2030 agenda is one example of such a sustainability vision, but of course there are many others, as also both actually Adrian and Oonsie have said, different visions in different parts of the world as well. Here, the SDGs, it's really the values that it involves, or it's values about people, it's about values about the planet, prosperity, peace, partnerships, so many different realms. And we can also say that that's the picture below. Sustainability is like the compass, or the SDGs in particular here, is like the compass for a better future. So it's highly normative. So we argue in this paper that if we researchers like to generate knowledge that is relevant to achieving sustainable development, we need to somehow analytically also engage with this normative compass. But this is not trivial, and I'd like to highlight two challenges that are related. The first one is that sustainability values can be contested and that there are many different sustainability visions around the world. And as also the two other speakers have said, there are many trade-offs between different even values within one sustainability vision. And for example, here is a insights or a little insight in a research project I conducted in the Swiss Alps on sustainable water management. And I was asked if a hydropower dam contributes to the SDGs, helps to advance them. And the answer is not easy because, as you can see already on the slide, there are many positives, but also negative effects on different sustainable development goals. For example, there are positive effects on water security, on economic growth, climate change mitigation, but there are also negative ones, in particular for biodiversity, water, land-related biodiversity, and in some cases also for agriculture, it was negative because it's a water use competition. The second challenge, so the challenge here is that when we like to use sustainability as sort of a compass, it's not easy to just define what it is. The second challenge, it's more about this ideal of the classical science as objective and value-free. So the idea to deal with value for many scientists, not in all disciplines, and maybe not for many of you here in this webinar, but in the classical science, this is really a very big ideal to separate facts from values. There are indeed many good reasons for doing this separation. For example, that knowledge is not intermingled with ideology, fake news, etc., in unhealthy way. And that's something I think we also see currently quite heavily in related to the corona pandemic. But it's also, of course, very challenging, and at least also because this distinction between facts and values is not easy to make, and it's often very fuzzy. That's what science studies have clearly shown in the last years. On the one hand, it's already what regards the epistemological values. We can see this very nicely. So the values that define what good science is. So science in this sense is not just value free, because science, to say something is scientific, is a value statement, saying it corresponds to values of good science, such as curiosity, honesty, humility regarding evidence, skepticism, and many other values. The second theme, it's more about the ethical values involved. And also there, the relation between facts and values can be very fuzzy, for example, when it's about states of cultural or ecological, economic, social dynamics. Because, for example, I think the identification of research question is very compelling. Whenever we identify a research question, it's not possible to do this outside of values, because, for example, when we decide to ask a research question about the functioning of an ecosystem, but maybe not addressing questions of economic growth at the same time, this is also a value decision. Yeah, it orients our thinking in certain direction. While facts and values come often together, I think it's nevertheless very important to see, to understand that they somehow belong to different realms. Yeah, facts it's about the what is, what we can see, observe, and the values, it's more about the what ought to be. Yeah, it's what we wish to be. And in particular, in democratic societies, there is a very strong idea that science should not prescribe what the good life is. This is the field of politics, and it's something that the whole society should be involved in its negotiation. So I argue, instead of just unsuccessfully outsourcing the normative questions from science and doing as if science is just neutral, we must find a different way of addressing normativity in the scientific processes. And for this, we identified 4 different tasks that we believe that they are important. And I will now quickly address each one of them. The first task actually mainly targets social scientists. It's about that we need to investigate much deeper what ethical values are involved in sustainability. So, for example, what values are prioritized by different stakeholders in different contexts of the world? Here, values in relation to science are really the object of science. So it's still somehow in the traditional idea of doing science. The second task is it targets all scientists. It says that what is important is to explicitly spell out what sustainability values guide the research. It's not to just say, well, we want to contribute to sustainability, but not saying what, or not mentioning it at all, but to really say what values are this reference point. So it can mean, for example, to use a specific definition that is out there, like the SDGs, or also a more local vision. So the risk when not doing so is that also regarding the SDGs, that different people might just pick out the SDGs that they like the most, and then, for example, say, well, we contribute to SDG 16 about economic growth, and this is sustainable, but neglecting that it's really about the holistic idea of sustainability. The third task is about this finding of common ground on contextualizing sustainability. And I'd say actually it's a lot about what Oonsie has also talked about, these visioning processes. And here the values, they are really deliberated. So they are not just the object or the reference point, but they are deliberated with the stakeholders involved in the different contexts. It's about participatory visioning exercises, transdisciplinary processes, etc. And the last one, the fourth task, is to clarify their own normative and epistemological assumptions, because when we deal with these normative questions in research and we see how difficult it is to disentangle them, but also the risks when they just get confused, we believe that it's really important to think about our own values, because otherwise they might just unseen trickle into the research. So we believe that it's very important in academia as a whole, so at universities, in higher education, that this becomes a usual practice to reflect about their own values.
Great, Florina, that's excellent. And again, I'm seeing it's really great because the Jamboard is filling up with questions about your presentation, and we're all seem to be very interested about this sort of how the implications of all of these ideas for our science system. So without further ado, since we're running a little bit late, but we still have plenty of time. We have about 34 minutes. What I'd like to do, since I think if everyone doesn't know already, we're using the Jamboard for our questions. So go to the chat to find the link to the Jamboard. We are going to divide up into 3 groups, and all 3 groups they're just random, and we'll all be talking about the same questions on the Jamboard. And I believe one of our Paris office facilitators is going to break us out into these breakout groups, and we'll have approximately 25 minutes or so. And then our facilitators will come back and sort of recap the highlights of each group, and we'll have about 8 minutes or so to share before we close.
Very much, for your presentation. I'll just speak to the first sort of sticky notes. It says, are there any particular barriers that tend to be found often when considering how to upscale seeds? What are some barriers that are typically easy to identify, if any?
No, I think this is actually a very common question around the seeds, and it is something that we're busy working on and going to do some more work around. I see some other people I recognize here. So, I mean, I think what is interesting though is to think about what the people that are leading these initiatives themselves identify, but maybe also some of the things that possibly some bigger actors in the system also identify, because I think, they can be quite interesting differences and also things that people miss at the smaller scales. But I mean, obviously because a lot of these initiatives are quite small scale. So I think they're often, being run by people that are passionate about some particular thing, but they're very short on resources and staff. I would almost say is like one of the most common things that comes up. And I think also, maybe just a reflection, and it would be nice to maybe hear from other people in the group if they've worked on similar things. But I feel there's actually quite a lot we can also learn from looking maybe a little bit more at the kind of innovation around new technologies, and more in the space of innovation studies, because I think that some of the issues we're encountering with these kind of social ecological innovations are quite similar, but I think there are also some unique ones.
Hi, so I just wanted to add, I think I've come across your initiative, Oonsie, because I'm from the Montreal hub, and here we are also under our initiative, Sustainability in the Digital Age. We're also developing a database of action, initiatives that's leveraging digital tech to address climate action. But of course, it's still very, it's still pretty high level, and we are assessing websites to understand what exactly they're doing, what technologies they're leveraging. So we haven't gone into assessing their impact, whether they're actually successful. So it's still at the early stage, I suppose, but we have roughly 197 initiatives or so. I think the question is, what exactly makes an initiative successful? How do we assess it? That's a really interesting question to know. And even the project I'm working on is also focusing on how we can support philanthropy and basically let them know how to support initiatives that's leveraging digital tech to scale these actions across the globe. But the question is, what initiatives to scale? Because we don't know what exactly, who is successful or not, and also how they can go about doing it. So it's very interesting. I guess I'm not really answering anything. I'm just adding to questions, but I just wanted to know we're also doing a database. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Nilushi. Do you want to expand?
If I may come in, I'm sorry, I can't raise my hand for some reason. It doesn't seem to be possible. I'm Thomas Reuter. I'm in the CAN steering group. And I just wanted to say, I think the issue of scaling is very important. There's many fantastic ideas out there. I do research in Indonesia with local farmers there, and they have fantastic ideas for sustainable agriculture. How do you get those ideas to other people who might use them? And of course, there's some exchange of ideas happening, let's say, via organizations such as La Via Campesina. But if you want to scale ideas, you need, in this day and age, I think, digital platforms. So for those of you who are interested, I'm working on a digital platform for sharing ideas for local action globally among communities, peer-to-peer. So I think that's, obviously I'm doing that because I think that's the answer to these issues. And then you can also bring in science. You can bring in science to link, you can link scientists to individual groups of local actors who have specific problems that specific scientists happen to be working on, and they can immediately apply their expertise by collaborating with these local actors. So I think that's probably the way to go forward.
Thanks, Thomas. Any reactions from Oonsie or anyone else in the group? Ariane?
Maybe just sort of two related thoughts, because it's always interesting hearing about things also in different contexts. But I also think, yeah, maybe also one of the interesting questions to me is how do you even get people or help foster these kind of innovative ideas and even start an initiative? Because I think what we're often focusing on is once there is something, how do we then either scale it up in terms of kind of maybe impacting things at larger scale, so that we don't have it just like a little initiative in a town, but maybe adopting it nationally or internationally, or maybe replicating it. So that's sort of the idea of scaling out. And then there's obviously also scaling deep. So how do we impact more of the kind of deeper underlying assumptions and values maybe through some of these initiatives? But I wonder, I mean, nowadays there seems to be a lot of initiatives, but I wonder also what is the kind of space that we're creating also for leadership and creative thinking to even come up with ideas and at least get some of them going or prototyping, because I think that's where we find like that's really being done. So we've done a little project here in South Africa with some food seeds that we interviewed people in depth to understand sort of how they came to the idea and started the initiative. But that's often really done, yeah, just off someone's own bat and because of particular events in their life that maybe got them doing something. And it feels like, yeah, how do we maybe also create more space for more of that to happen, to think about different ways that we could address the challenges we face, in addition to then thinking about how do we then support things that now, little innovations that already exist to have further reach in different ways.
Yeah, I think if I may just say, I think it's not possible to control that, or very difficult to support it, like you say. But it's more a matter of capturing the good ideas, because there are people who want those ideas, who have problems to solve, and they want a good practical idea, a good solution. They're going to scale it by themselves. You don't need to make them or help them or support them. You just have to let them know about those ideas. So I think it's really a matter of what we can easily do is communicate or create some way to exchange those ideas, and those who need them will pick them up. You don't need to encourage them. They'll do it out of self-interest, if you know what I mean. Let's say, some community in South Africa has found a great way to save water. Similar communities around the world will say, wow, this is great, let's do it.
I guess
especially if it's at a cost that's commensurate with their means.
I guess where it becomes more challenging, I think, is I think we're also often thinking about what are things that are somewhat fitting within the current system, or like saving water is sort of something that we're faced with that problem, and then we want to do it. But what about things that, and I think this is at least some of our thinking with the seeds work, that we're actually trying to disrupt, like seriously disrupt the much bigger system. And so some of the innovations, like they don't actually fit well with the current system. So for instance, I think like there's some initiatives around here in Stellenbosch that is much more focused on wild foods, or and the whole way the food system is set up is not really supporting that kind of alternative way of thinking or doing things. And what kind of space can you make for also thinking through some of the potential negative impacts of scaling up some of these innovations, but also maybe experimenting a bit more with some of them.
I also wanted to add that we were talking about transformative initiatives, and that was we have in our database 4 different categories of the strategies these initiatives use. And they range from just making data more available to also really engaging citizens and transferring the power to them to act against their climate issues. And those initiatives that we empower communities was actually the very smallest category that had the smallest number of initiatives that fell into that category. And the most of the initiatives actually fell into data mobilization, where they just, make available data. So there's so much data out there that you're just inundated with it, and you don't know what exactly to do with it. But those initiatives that can really engage and include participatory methods are fewer in number. Or at least not well advertised,
No, most certainly. And I also want to speak to, I think it speaks very nicely to one of the questions that have been raised in this Jamboard. And that is the traditional, science outdated or ill-equipped to address sustainability challenges we're facing? And that speaks also to Flurina's presentation around power structures and how we relate, to powers, and how we essentially, have that normative understanding of, what is right, what's wrong, these trade-offs and synergies. And I think, that the title of the session itself is quite relevant, because these are very nice words, but do communities even understand what they mean? When they start, a community-led project, do they even understand, what trade-offs there are, what synergies there are, and how do we sort of get them involved early on, educate them? And is this possible within the current margins of how science is currently conducted?
So I'm going to ask a question that is from somebody fairly ignorant on the whole pathways things, but Oonsie was talking about the seeds, and maybe this person Thomas that talked also, it's the pathways or the initiatives that they're talking about scaling seem like something that might be very case specific, how to deal with some issue with water, how to be more productive in agriculture. So yeah, those techniques that can be learned. And then Oonsie mentioned this interest on things that can be more disruptive and can really change the system at the level in which it's like putting serious impediments to global sustainability. And I have a really hard time to think of which ones are those. So if you could talk about that type, what are these type of bottom-up initiatives that have that power of disruption? And if there's some good example, I would love to hear that.
That's a good challenging question, because I think, and Nalushi, I'd be really interested to see your criteria that you mentioned, because actually one of the things we've been struggling a lot with in the Seeds project is trying to identify which seeds do we think have this kind of bigger systemic transformation potential. And maybe even asking like, is that possible? But to identify those, because I think, and that's where I quite like the seed metaphor, because in a sense I was, wonder sometimes it's like that a certain innovation is maybe not that thing that does the transformation or that has the impact, but sometimes I think one innovation, it opens up a space for something else, and which maybe even opens up a space for something else. So it's like a chain of things that build on each other. And I guess we've got lots of those also from technology, you know, like even the start with like the first version of the internet, and then, you know, it kind of opens up new spaces, and now we're already like, you know, in a different kind of world where, you know, we're meeting online, which wasn't possible before, and doing things in different ways. So, you know, it's also understanding those chains. And another issue that I think that I grapple with quite a bit is, so we're, you know, in our space maybe often thinking more of some sort of seeds related to the environment or sustainability. But I often wonder if some of the innovations that might have the biggest impact, maybe at the side of it, have nothing to do with the environment. So, you know, like what if some of the things that are really going to drive this like massive systemic reshuffling that then opens up whole new spaces, or, you know, things around cryptocurrency, or you know, some other things that don't directly seem to be connected to the environment. So I think it's really also often the ways in which these different things are coming together, rather than I think often the individual thing. And that's where I sometimes wonder if we're a little bit too much stuck in a kind of a technology paradigm, where we're thinking of, you know, like, what's the best toilet that flushes the best and uses the least water, and we're going to find that one toilet, and then we're going to give it to everyone in the world. And I think like with a lot of the kinds of challenges we're facing now, they're much more complex, and they're much more multidimensional. So it's not, you know, we're not really just trying to find that one optimal thing that we can give to everyone. Yeah, those are some thoughts. And maybe Thabo, just to come back to your question about science, I'm sure everyone here has some reflections on this. But I mean, I think just from our own work, I do think one of the big challenges is also the collaborative nature of how we're working, and that in like the traditional academy is very individual focused in a sense, even though they can be centers, but I mean, ultimately you're putting your name on papers. Yeah, so I think it's this kind of both the fact that we're often now working transdisciplinary and outside the academy with people that maybe are operating within different contexts, which already makes it difficult, especially if you're working with, for instance, some of these seed operators that have little time and money. But also if we're working in big groups and actually what we're producing is really the outcome of the group, then yeah, I sometimes feel like there's an overemphasis on the individual, rather than kind of acknowledging that these things are really like emergent products of bigger group interactions.
Which is a power structure in itself, I guess. Ariane, you had something to add?
Oh, I don't know now. There's like 5 different things. And I probably need to parse them out.
You got 2 minutes.
I just 2 things. One is like, I keep going back to the science structure issue, because I've spent the last 6 years of my life like trying to kind of build sort of transdisciplinary capabilities into the future Earth system of research networks, and pushing that system towards change, even just the system with all these open-minded and very willing people, has been tremendously difficult. I still would not underestimate the value, and there's interesting, promising changes happening with the advent of the assembly. I would just invite everyone here, I mean, just to remind ourselves that this initiative was created precisely because of this issue that we're talking about, and that we can all be a part of that at some level. So there's sort of a meta level here. The second thought I just had was sort of about this relationship between technology and institutions and cultural change. And, you know, without diminishing the importance of the sort of the need for small and local approaches, you know, grand transformations in, for example, energy infrastructure, you know, which is not a toilet, but like a connected, complex network, is going to require large scale investment and change through the institutions, that we know of today, like the governments that we have, the democracies and authoritarian structures that we have. And so I think I think the science system again needs to be really smart about where we position ourselves in those, and also maintaining our own normative reflexivity about what we can do as scientists. So that was really too much ground to cover in 2 minutes.
Yeah, I think we've covered a lot already. There's 1 minute left, and is there anyone who wants to raise any question before I raise mine and we close? So Oonsie, in your seed scenarios, you mentioned technology as both an opportunity as well as a risk. I wondered what that meant from my side.
I think maybe just quickly is in terms of one of the key things we found was the ability for technology now to also mean maybe people can live much more dispersed, and people can also connect much better and participate in decision making. But it also means, and we're seeing that already, that you can kind of end up get sucked into your own little community and world paradigm and actually not hearing more views. So we see both those dynamics at play now. We can connect here across the world, but we also see, also more radical kind of groups and actually conflict.
The conversation is really just about what Florina was talking about, which is really an excellent conversation, presentation about the normativity in science. So I think it's really just open to people to, if you want to discuss further, maybe more questions around the presentation that Florina just had. And since it's not really a big room, it might just be, we could start by raising hands, but if that doesn't work, we can also just unmute ourselves and go ahead with the questions. And thank you, Florina, for that really inspiring presentation.
And maybe if I can add on the Jamboard, on the questions, the right part is the questions to Florina. So maybe Florina, if you want at some point to tell us how these questions resonate for you.
And there is one question. It says, could you define what normative means in the different contexts you presented? The question arises from an oceanographer. And so, I would say normative might mean a similar thing in different contexts, but the content of this normativity might be very different. So what people believe is good or bad. So normative itself just means it's about ideas of the good or the bad. And I think in most cultures, something like this exists, so that they have their visions, where they like to go, what they think is good or not. But then it can I just see around your names, and I see African names, I see Asian names, I think, European names, and in all these parts, this might be interpreted differently. And for knowing what this is, we need, on the one hand, research to understand, to ask the people, but then also really to engage in groups and make them discuss. Because it does not say that just what certain people believe is the good thing, that this is also sustainable.
I'm a PhD researcher in coastal management, and most often I have this question about what she just presented today, on how best I can include the epistemologies within my research. Most of the time I'm dealing with GIS and applications, and I'm trying to link epistemologies and to my research design. So if she could actually help me there, further to what she has under on normative design. Thank you.
What do you mean by linking epistemologies to your GIS research? I cannot imagine exactly what you mean.
Yeah, like you said, in research, like most students in natural science, we find it difficult to link the epistemological ideology of my research, like to which epistemology do that research for. So
Yes.
And today you have talked about value addition, value laden, and maybe value unladen research. So if you can try to round it on that, yeah.
Okay, so not sure if I understand right, but one thing that comes to my mind is that when I work with natural scientists, I often see that for example, I often work with biodiversity scientists, and they are convinced that they are doing objective and value-free research.
Yeah, that's true.
Biodiversity is something very normative because it somehow states that it's a good thing to have biodiversity, that they are often very convinced that biodiversity must be conserved, but this is a normative position. It's not just proven by research. The more biodiversity we have, the better.
Yeah, that's very true. That's that's my part of my question actually, because as a young researcher, I would love to really understand how you would link that normative approach to the entire research design, because I mean, normally I would just round it up on my objectivity to the conclusions, but then as you are coming in, you are putting values, synergically just to have values. So yeah.
Yes. So my point here is to say it's fine if you work on biodiversity because it is something important, probably, yeah. But it's important to state this is the goal. This is a normative aspect of the research. Yeah? I think that's the important point.
All right, thank you.
And to be aware again to not just make this intrude yourself like an ideology, but that you again and again reflect, okay, what it is really what makes biodiversity an important goal, and that you also see the counterfactual, etc. Yeah.
Thanks, Florina and Blessing. I see Mark has his hand up, but I think this is a really interesting conversation about because you always have to ask the question, good for who and good for what, and I think that's where the conversation becomes interesting. But Mark, please.
Yeah, thank you, Odie, and thank you, Florina. That was great to sort of hear the paper in your own words, sort of thing. I was just falling to wondering how you would relate this to the old roles of a scientist that Roger Pielke used to talk about in terms of the degree to which scientists saw themselves as somehow the pure scientist or a lobbyist or a person working for government and engaged in trying to encourage a particular outcome. Clearly there's a self-perception that's part of the underlying framing of the four tasks that you outlined at the end there. I'm just asking for your thoughts on that, and perhaps the fact that different people do play different, or can play different roles, can choose to play different roles.
Exactly. I think it fits very well together, the two. It's that the researchers must really reflect about what type of role they like to play. And for example, I mean, for those who don't know these four roles, one is an issue advocate. And in the classical science, this is somehow not well seen because it's seen as a lobbyist. Yeah? But the Pielke says it can be an adequate role if we make this very explicit. If we say, for example, I'm a little bit an issue advocate by saying, I want to contribute to sustainable development with my research. This is the goal of my research. So, and I will direct the whole research towards this goal. Of course, this is a very broad goal. And within this, I would also say, I'm acting as an honest broker. This is a second role that is mentioned by him. So the honest broker is saying, look, there are different options. You have maybe the pathways of Oonsie. Yeah? You have different pathways when you go this one, we have advantages and disadvantages. When you go there, you have this and that. But maybe in addition, you should reflect about all what you just presented. We have equity problems. It's also to give in a bit our own scientific perspective. The third role, the one was the pure scientist. Yeah? So it's this traditional natural science idea, you just do research. You are completely disconnected from society somehow. And if somebody comes, a stakeholder comes and asks you, can you give me advice? I want to conserve biodiversity, what should I do? So the pure scientist would just hand over his data without interpretation, just Excel table with numbers and say, okay, look, that's the data. It's up to you to interpret. And then it was the first, then there is the advisor. The advisor would say, if somebody comes say, hey, can you help me with biodiversity conservation? He would say, he would directly answer his question, but not give any additional thoughts about that. Well, there might be concerns for equity, for example, because he only answers the questions that come from the stakeholder. So that's a bit, I think, yeah, it fits very well together.
So thanks, Florina. I think this conversation, in a way, this discussion reminds me of the discussion before this, when people are discussing whether one discipline, when other people are starting to not fit in one discipline anymore. And the conversation was, do you need to be more discipline aligned or not? And obviously over time, we've learned that it's not a choice. All of those different roles are valuable and are needed. People working between disciplines and people working in disciplines. And it seems it's reflecting the same sort of dynamic of people playing different roles. And while I don't see any question, maybe I ask one myself, which is that the incentives as a researcher are often aligned to some idea of what your role should be. And maybe some roles are punished or not recognized. And I wonder what your thoughts are there in terms of what are the incentives for researchers linked to this other dimensions of what you could be, what are the different roles you could be playing? Mm-hmm. Thanks.
I mean, I think this is exactly the reason why we say the whole science systems must change, because there are so many incentives towards the pure scientist, yeah, to publish in high-ranked journals, to get the prestigious grants that require this, etc. And there are very, at least, for example, in my university, Goethe University, what they want to see is excellence, and in the traditional criteria, not in the other ones. And I think it's also up to really us to work on this transformation. And I think on all levels. I just had a discussion with some fellow professors. I'm new at this university, so just a couple of months, and they told me, well, but we cannot do interdisciplinary PhDs. We will punish them. They will not find a job afterwards. We all want interdisciplinarity, but we cannot do that because we will punish the student. And I said, hey, but if we don't offer this, who will then ever offer it, that the whole system will change? And I think, I mean, we are all maybe from different age, different career stages here. So I think we all have our possibilities to, on one hand, we need to be strategic. I mean, I also need to write my papers and to just tick the boxes. But we also have really freedom to change at the places where we are, and we should really stretch this space. That's my position there.
Thanks, Serena. That's very useful. I see Gary Cuss has some comments. I don't know if you want to speak to some of those, Gary.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, no, this is a fascinating conversation, and thank you so much for convening it. Yeah, I mean, I think the normative point that Flurina's made is absolutely fundamental, and I work kind of at the interface of science and policy in that kind of murky world of the science policy interface, and everything we do in policy is normatively driven. I mean, it kind of has to be. That's kind of what policy is. but we can adopt that kind of role, that PLCA's role, as the honest broker of policy alternatives. As a government scientist, that's kind of what I do. Occasionally, because I work for an organization that is driven by normative goals, I can represent those goals through the science I do. So I can be an issue advocate, but I can't be a stealth issue advocate. I have to do it openly. And I very rarely am just what's the phrase? The kind of, I can't remember the phrase he uses now. The one way, well, you described it, where somebody comes to you with a very specific question, you give them a very specific answer. The arbiter, that's right, the role of the arbiter. That is so rare. That is so rare. Nobody ever comes to me and asks a very specific question to which I can give a very specific answer. And you know, I think what you said about the pure scientist is they will give you their data if you're lucky, and if you ask nicely enough, and possibly even if you pay them, but they do not feel in the least bit incentivized to do that. However, we do have in the UK this research excellence framework, and we're in the middle of it at the moment. We do it every 7 years, and we're in the middle of the current phase. And having created this incentive around impact back in 2014, we have seen over the last 7 years a really quite substantial change in the way that universities and units within universities have actually adapted their own behaviors in response to that incentive. So we can create levers, and we can pull on those levers to enable that transformation within the academy itself, to move much more towards impact. It doesn't necessarily, though, and this is quite interesting, doesn't necessarily drive people towards becoming more interdisciplinary, or let alone transdisciplinary. They can just be seeking impact within their own disciplines. So that's still perhaps a bit of a sticky point, because the way that our excellence framework is structured and the way that the process operates is we have units of assessment that are essentially disciplinary based. Now, I work in geography and environmental studies, which is a bit more inherently transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary, but you know, we still need input from biologists, we still need input from political scientists, we still need input from humanitarians, you know, humanities scholars, etc. But that kind of structure is still not there, and ultimately what we're doing is dealing with a kind of continuum, and we're always going to chop it up into bits, and there's always going to be problems with those boundaries, and those boundaries are always going to be shifting, and kind of the whole area of boundary work, and me as a boundary spanner, is, you know, just keeps me getting up in the morning. So yeah.
Thanks, Gary. I don't know if there's some reflection back from Florina on what Gary just said, or
I mean, I think it resonates. It's a nice contribution and resonates well with the other things that have been said.
All right, thanks. Just to comment on that, like I said, I'm a PhD student in coastal management, coastal zone management, and dealing with mainly coastal erosion management, sea defenses, but mainly most of the work then it crossovers to communities, and we have most of those transdisciplinary skills in order to engage with communities and, you know, try to, you know, coordinate programs on climate coastal change adaptation. So that's the reason why I got interested in this transdisciplinary research, you know, and pathways to sustainability. Thank you.
Well, sorry I was late joining you due to another meeting. And funnily enough, this meeting was concerning a cooperation between human sciences and hard sciences in teledetection with a program linking Guinea and France. So I just would like to give the testimony that it's still difficult for scientific academics to recognize that they can work on the same level with humanitarian sciences academics, and some would like to keep a sort of supremacy over the others, and basically we need to learn the tools and the way of working of the other community we want to work with. So it's a long process of cross-cultural education, I would say. And my experience, because you see I have no more hair and I am a bit bald, is that it takes time, but it's really rewarding. So whatever the obstacles for the recognition of the work you do with other fields of science and different types of science, it's a long way, but I think it is very important. And I would say that to the youngest presence in our committee today, try hard, and at the end of the road, it's very rewarding. So it's a message of encouragement.
Thanks, Mark. We have 1 minute to go, but I think this is also speaking to this issue of slow science, that in a way to engage with this kind of work, you do need to slow down the science. But Florina, maybe a word of closing from you. I see you raise your hand, please.
Yeah, I didn't want to interrupt you. I just, what Mark said, it resonated with me in the sense that in my university, for example, they now try to create spaces where the humanities, social science, and natural science can contribute. But what they do is actually they frame it through the natural science lens. So they said, well, let's take system science as the boundary object. And I mean, I like system science. It's a very good thing to do, but it's not the approach for the humanities.
Hi, everyone. It's great to have you back. Our discussion was super active. And so what I'm going to do before we close in the next 9 minutes is ask you all to go to your Jamboards for your group and then just write any sort of last reflections over the discussion in the board. We'll be able to all access those after the meeting. But what I'm going to do is call each of our facilitators from each group 1, 2, and 3 to give and share a short feedback on the group discussion. So without further ado, unless there's other things we need to add before then, I would turn it over to the facilitator of group 1, which is Mariela.
Okay, so yeah, as you said, Adrian, we had a really interesting conversation. Mainly, we discussed about the initiatives that need to be found and how we assess them, how we scale them up, how initiatives bring new initiatives, and how space opens up new, different space for new initiatives. And then there are good ideas that are practical ideas and that the people can capture them and communicate them. And then it's very important to exchange these ideas in order for people to organize themselves in different communities and start a new initiative. So yeah, basically that was it. We discussed about science as well, the role of science and technology in these initiatives that are needed, and synergies, communities, how well they have to be educated in order to understand what synergies and initiatives are.
All right, so for group 2, Judith, would you like to give a summary and let us know how it went?
Thank you. Yes. So in group 2, we first focused on putting some of these ideas that we heard into practice. Developing capacity for transdisciplinary engagement is often difficult outside of academia, and there is no blueprint that works well across the world. So there are quite a few different ways of doing this. Looking beyond projects, taking care of relationships and caring and shared values. But then our discussion shifted a little bit, saying that, well, okay, this is great. Working with stakeholders is very important, but actually for action, it's really important to engage face-to-face with policymakers. And sometimes that can be a little bit of a hostile environment, or maybe an environment of non-action, especially when it comes to addressing biodiversity loss and climate change, despite all the efforts that the scientists are putting into it, even at high-level political fora, such as the IPBES and IPCC. And then we got a little bit into a discussion on how maybe this kind and gentle attitude and listening from scientists is not necessarily the most effective. And potentially you can shift a little bit and go on an offensive and really demand action from the government and work with the stakeholders at the highest levels of power, such as government, and do a little bit of top-down action. And also got into the discussion that countries do negotiations. And these negotiations, especially when it comes to biodiversity loss, often don't really lead to action and change. They are a little bit on the level of lip service to the existing agreements and not necessarily making any changes. So we went from different attitudes, but it's really important, I think, to mention still, we also shared some papers in the chat. So I think there was a lot of exchange going on. But I do want to emphasize that from our group also, it was apparent that people want to stay in touch with each other and still contact each other. So if we can facilitate the community of practice and have a community building exercise here, that would be quite important as well to continue exchanging these ideas.
Okay, well then, so let's, we've got about 4 minutes left. So let's hear from Sandrine, who will summarize for group 3.
Hi, everyone. It was a good discussion as well in group 3. We discussed a lot about the different kinds of role researchers can play: activist, honest broker, advisor, or pure scientist. And we discussed the way how we can, take concretely these roles into account in our research, the epistemological dimension of these different roles. We also talked about the reward system, which is really, focused on pure scientist role. And it's especially difficult for early careers to take different types of roles beside the pure scientist one. And finally, as a conclusion, we also said that working across, at least the participants said that working across disciplines is still very difficult between the humanities and natural science in particular. It's a long learning process, but he emphasized that it's worth it because at the end it's very rewarding to work across disciplines.
Well, if there aren't any other questions or thoughts right now, I'm going to pass it off to Gilles to close. But before I do that, I'd like to just say on behalf of the steering committee of the Pathways Initiative that we so appreciate you all being here and showing up for this inaugural moment. And I feel like so many sort of the wheel and spokes have sort of been thrown out, and we can continue to build off of those. And we want to do that together with all of you. And so you can always send your questions and your thoughts to our fearless facilitators and conveners at the Paris office. And that's also who I'd like to thank, all the staff of the Future Earth Paris Hub, who have been unflinching and courageous supporters of this Pathways Initiative as a real way to move forward towards a different science system, a transformative science system. And so with that, I will pass it over to Gilles. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much, Ariane. And yeah, you captured it really well in your last few words, but I also want to thank all of you for participating in this forum today, to our great speakers and to the facilitators and everyone working behind the scene to make sure that this forum was a good starting point in our collective journey. I also want to remind you that, as I said earlier, we really want you to feel that the Pathways Forum is a space that you can actively contribute to and shape. And for this reason, before we close this first Pathways Forum, I would like to invite you to take a few minutes to give feedback on this forum, what you felt worked and what didn't work so well, and make suggestions in terms of topics or formats for future forums. And you can make these suggestions on Jamboard. Cosma will probably provide a link in the chat box if she hasn't already done so. And also I want to mention that the Jamboard will remain accessible after the end of this forum, so you can always go back and revisit some of the comments that were made, post additional comments if you want to, and so on. So thank you very much. Yeah, and hope to see you soon for the next forum in 2 months.